The Dakota Territory, 1878. A harsh land where only the strongest survived, and fortunes were built on blood, sweat, and often the misfortune of others. The setting sun cast long shadows across Black Ridge, a mining town nestled between jagged mountains and endless prairie. Dust swirled through the streets as the last stagecoach of the day rattled past the wooden storefronts. Men with weathered faces and calloused hands made their way to Holcomb's saloon, seeking respite from the day's labor in the silver mines that had made Edmund Blackwood the richest man in 3 territories. In his enormous mansion on the hill overlooking the town that bore his family name, Blackwood stood at the window, a tumbler of expensive whiskey in his hand, surveying his domain with the cold calculation of a man who took what he wanted and discarded what he didn't. At 45, his once black hair was streaked with gray, his face carved by years of ruthless business dealings and the harsh Western elements. His empire stretched across the Dakota Territory: silver mines, cattle ranches, lumber mills, and now the railroad that would soon connect Black Ridge to markets in the East, multiplying his already substantial fortune. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to our channel. We'd love to know what city you're watching from. Down in the valley, in a small, dilapidated cabin on the outskirts of town, Sarah Thornton stirred a pot of thin stew over a meager fire. At 22, her beauty remained untouched by the hardships she had endured since her mother's death 2 years prior. Her father, once a respected prospector with dreams of striking silver, had descended into the bottle after losing his claim to Blackwood in a disputed property line. Now, Thomas Thornton spent his days and what little money they had at Holcomb's, drowning his failures in cheap whiskey, while his daughter took in mending and laundry to keep food on their table. Sarah wiped a strand of auburn hair from her face and glanced at the door, knowing her father would return soon, either in a rage or a stupor, depending on how the cards had treated him. She had long ago stopped hoping for the return of the gentle, ambitious man who had brought her west following her mother's passing, promising a new beginning. That man had vanished into the bottom of countless bottles, leaving behind a bitter shell who blamed his daughter for their misfortunes almost as often as he blamed Edmund Blackwood. Sheriff James Keller leaned against the hitching post outside his office, watching the comings and goings of Black Ridge with sharp blue eyes that missed little. At 50, the former Union cavalry officer had seen enough violence to last several lifetimes, yet he'd chosen to pin on a badge in this rough-and-tumble mining town 5 years ago when Blackwood had personally recruited him to keep the peace. Keller understood the arrangement: maintain order among the miners and townspeople, but turn a blind eye to Blackwood's business practices, which often straddled the line between shrewd and illegal. It was a compromise that sat uneasily on the lawman's conscience, but one he had grudgingly accepted until recently. The rumors about Blackwood's methods of acquiring new properties had become harder to ignore, and Keller had begun making discreet inquiries that would have enraged his employer had he known. The sheriff straightened as Thomas Thornton stumbled out of the saloon, nearly falling into the muddy street. Another night, another drunk to escort home. Inside Holcomb's saloon, the piano player pounded out a lively tune as miners spent their hard-earned wages on watered-down whiskey and rigged card games. Maxwell Holcomb, a corpulent man with a waxed mustache and shrewd eyes, watched his patrons from behind the bar, mentally calculating the evening's profits. His establishment was the finest in Black Ridge, which wasn't saying much, but it served as the social center of the town, and more importantly, As a gathering place for information, Holcomb's ears were always open, and the intelligence he collected often found its way to Blackwood in exchange for favorable business arrangements. Tonight, however, Holcomb's attention was focused on Thomas Thornton, who had lost his last dollar at the poker table and was now desperately trying to convince the other players to extend him credit. "Thornton," Holcomb called, "you're done for the night. Go home to your daughter." Thomas swayed on his feet, his bloodshot eyes filled with desperate anger. "One more game," he slurred. "I got something worth betting. Something even Blackwood himself might want." William Hayes closed his medical bag with a weary sigh. He had just finished stitching up a miner's arm after a drilling accident, the third such injury this week. At 62, Hayes had practiced medicine on the frontier for over 30 years, treating everything from gunshot wounds to cholera outbreaks with equal dedication and increasingly limited supplies. He had come to Blackridge at Blackwood's invitation, lured by the promise of a proper clinic and decent pay, only to find himself serving as the company doctor, primarily patching up Blackwood's employees so they could return to work as quickly as possible. The aging physician washed the blood from his hands in a basin of increasingly pink water and gazed out the window at Blackwood's mansion on the hill. Few who entered that house as adversaries ever emerged with their dignity or finances intact, and Hayes had treated enough broken men to know the pattern. Recently, Blackwood had been particularly focused on acquiring the remaining independent properties along the planned railroad route, and his methods had grown more aggressive. Thomas Thornton stumbled through the cabin door well past midnight, a strange gleam in his eyes that made Sarah's heart sink. She had seen that look before, a dangerous mixture of drunken confidence and desperate scheme hatching that invariably led to disaster. "Pack your things," he slurred, swaying in the doorway. "Your troubles are over, girl. I found a solution to everything." Sarah set aside the shirt she was mending and regarded her father warily. "What have you done?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Made a deal with the devil himself. Blackwood's sending a carriage for you tomorrow. You're to be his bride." The words hung in the air like a death sentence as Sarah's world collapsed around her. "What are you saying?" Her voice trembled with disbelief and growing horror. Thomas avoided her gaze, suddenly finding great interest in removing his mud-caked boots. "Lost everything at cards tonight. Holcomb was about to throw me out when Blackwood came in. Made him an offer for you after hearing about your situation." The morning dawned clear and cold, sunlight glinting off the frost that covered the sparse grass around the Thornton cabin. Sarah had not slept, her mind racing between disbelief, terror, and desperate plans for escape. But where would she go? She had no money, no horse, and the nearest town was 30 miles across open country, frequented by outlaws and hostile bands of displaced natives. Her father had passed out shortly after delivering his devastating news, and now snored on his thin mattress, oblivious to the fact that he had traded his only daughter for a deed to a played-out silver claim and enough money to drink himself to death in comfort. Sarah's hands shook as she splashed cold water on her face and stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror. Would Blackwood really hold her father to such a bargain? The man's reputation for ruthlessness was legendary, but surely even he wouldn't force a woman into marriage against her will. The sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered her desperate hopes. Edmund Blackwood sat behind the massive oak desk in his study, reviewing contracts for the railroad spur that would connect his mines directly to the main line, eliminating the need for costly wagon trains. Everything was proceeding according to his meticulous plan, all but one small parcel of land that stubbornly remained beyond his grasp. The Ferguson property sat directly in the path of his planned rail line, and Old Man Ferguson had repeatedly refused to sell, despite increasingly generous offers. Blackwood's patience was wearing thin, and he was contemplating more direct methods of persuasion when his butler entered. "Miss Thornton has arrived, sir." Blackwood set aside the contracts and rose, straightening his immaculate vest. The unexpected opportunity that had presented itself last night at Holcomb's might solve multiple problems at once. A respectable marriage to a local girl would improve his standing with the territorial governor, whose support he needed for the railroad permits. And if Thomas Thornton's daughter was as beautiful as they said, she would make a suitable mistress of Blackwood Manor and mother to the heir he required. Sheriff Keller frowned as he watched Blackwood's carriage roll up the hill toward the mansion, a glimpse of a woman's pale face visible through the window. The rumors had reached him within hours. Thomas Thornton wagering his daughter in a card game, and Blackwood claiming the unusual prize. Such things weren't unheard of in the territories, where women were scarce and the law flexible, but it left a sour taste in Keller's mouth. He had known Sarah since she arrived in Blackridge with her father, had watched her struggle to maintain dignity and decency despite her father's decline. She deserved better than to be traded like cattle. The sheriff's hand dropped to the telegram in his pocket, a response to his discreet inquiries about Blackwood's business practices back east. The information it contained was incendiary, potentially enough to bring the mogul's empire crashing down. But timing was everything, and Keller needed more evidence before he could move against the most powerful man in the territory. Sarah stood in the opulent entrance hall of Blackwood Manor, trying to still her trembling as the butler disappeared to announce her arrival. The mansion was larger than any building she had ever entered, filled with luxuries she had only read about in the tattered novels that constituted her education. Persian carpets, oil paintings in gilt frames, furniture crafted from exotic woods. The display of wealth was overwhelming, a stark reminder of the vast gulf between her life and that of the man who had purchased her for the price of a deed and a bottle of fine whiskey. She heard footsteps approaching and steeled herself, determined to face whatever came with the dignity her father had discarded. Edmund Blackwood appeared in the doorway, his piercing gray eyes assessing her with the same calculating gaze he used when evaluating a new silver claim. Sarah met his gaze steadily, refusing to show fear despite the rapid beating of her heart. "Miss Thornton," Blackwood's voice was cultured, betraying his Eastern education. "Welcome to my home." He circled her slowly, noting her simple but clean dress, the proud set of her shoulders, the defiant tilt of her chin. Despite her circumstances, she showed none of the cowering submission he had expected. "Interesting. I assume your father explained our arrangement." Sarah's hands clenched at her sides. "He said you intend to marry me, in exchange for a mining claim and enough money to drink himself to death." The bluntness of her statement surprised a short laugh from Blackwood. Succinct and accurate. "I admire directness, Miss Thornton." He gestured for her to follow him into a richly appointed sitting room. "Please, be seated. We have much to discuss about our future together." Sarah remained standing. "Mr. Blackwood, I cannot be bought and sold like one of your properties. Whatever arrangement you made with my father, I did not consent to it." Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes as he poured 2 glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. Your consent, while preferable, is not strictly necessary. Your father has legal authority over you, and our agreement is binding. He held out a glass to her, which she ignored. However, I think you'll find I'm offering you an opportunity, not a prison sentence. As my wife, you'll want for nothing. This house will be yours to manage, my fortune at your disposal. Many women would consider it a favorable exchange for sharing my bed and bearing my children. The crude declaration, delivered with such casual arrogance, sent a flush of anger to Sarah's cheeks. And if I refuse? Blackwood set down the rejected glass and regarded her coolly. Then your father's debt remains unpaid. The claim he lost to me last night carried penalties for default, penalties that could send him to territorial prison for fraud. Additionally, I understand you've been taking in laundry without a proper business license. Another legal infraction I've been willing to overlook until now. Night fell over Blackridge, the silver mines disgorging their shift of weary workers into the darkening streets. In Holcomb's saloon, Thomas Thornton celebrated his sudden change in fortune, buying rounds for men who had avoided him just yesterday. The deed to a new claim burned in his pocket, not the original one he had lost years ago, but a promising plot Blackwood had thrown in as part of their bargain. The whiskey flowed freely as Thomas boasted of his clever deal-making, his drunken mind conveniently forgetting the daughter he had sacrificed for this momentary prosperity. In a corner of the saloon, Dr. Hayes nursed a single whiskey, listening to Thornton's boasting with undisguised disgust. The physician had treated Sarah for a fever last winter, had seen her selfless care for the father, who now traded her away without remorse. Hayes caught Sheriff Keller's eye across the room, noting the lawman's grim expression that mirrored his own thoughts. Up at Blackwood Manor, Sarah stood at the window of the lavish bedroom she had been given, gazing down at the town lights twinkling in the valley below. Her prison might be gilded, but it was a prison nonetheless. Blackwood had made the terms of her captivity clear. Marry him within the week, or watch her father face consequences that, despite everything, she couldn't bring herself to wish upon him. The mogul had left her alone after their conversation, instructing his housekeeper to see to her needs and informing her that a seamstress would arrive tomorrow to begin work on her wedding clothes. Sarah pressed her forehead against the cool glass, tears threatening for the first time since this nightmare began. She had always prided herself on her resourcefulness, her ability to endure hardship without breaking. But this? Being owned by a man who saw her as nothing more than a convenient broodmare and a social asset? Her fingers curled against the windowpane as determination replaced despair. She might be trapped for now, but Edmund Blackwood would soon discover that he had purchased far more trouble than he had bargained for. Sheriff Keller slipped out of town shortly after midnight, riding toward the Ferguson homestead, several miles beyond the edge of Blackwood's property. The old rancher was still awake, cleaning a rifle on his front porch as Keller approached. "Evening, Sheriff," Ferguson called, his voice carrying in the still night air. "Bit late for a social call." Keller dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post. "Not social, I'm afraid. Came to warn you. Blackwood's getting impatient about your land." Ferguson spat into the dirt. "Let him stew. This property has been in my family since before that eastern vulture ever set foot in the territory. Not selling for any price." Keller settled into a chair next to the old man. "He's taken to new tactics. You hear about Thomas Thornton's daughter?" Ferguson's weathered face darkened. "Heard rumors, that true?" Keller nodded grimly. "As a judge's verdict, she's up at the mansion now, being fitted for a wedding dress she doesn't want." The next morning, Blackwood summoned Sarah to his study after breakfast. She entered warily, noting the large windows overlooking the town. The walls lined with books she would once have been eager to explore. Now they represented just another facet of the cage being built around her. Blackwood stood as she entered, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "I trust you slept well?" he asked, his tone making it clear that her comfort was a secondary concern at best. Sarah remained standing. "What do you want from me, Mr. Blackwood? Beyond the obvious." A hint of admiration flickered across his face at her continued defiance. Directness again. Good. He sat, steepling his fingers. "I want what most men in my position want. A suitable wife to manage my household, entertain my business associates, and bear my children. You are young, healthy, and despite your humble circumstances, not without a certain refined quality. With proper clothing and instruction, you will serve adequately." Sarah's nails dug into her palms as she fought to maintain her composure. "You speak as if purchasing a horse, not proposing marriage." Blackwood's smile was thin. "The principle is not dissimilar. I require certain qualities and am willing to pay a fair price." He opened a drawer and removed a velvet box, placing it on the desk between them. "Consider this a token of our engagement. The seamstress will arrive at 10 to begin measurements for your trousseau. I expect you to cooperate fully." Sarah made no move to take the box. "And if I run? There are stagecoaches leaving Blackridge every day." Blackwood's eyes hardened. "The next one leaves with your father in chains for fraud. Additionally, I own the stage line. No one leaves this town without my knowledge or permission. Make peace with your situation, Miss Thornton. Your life here can be pleasant or miserable. The choice is largely yours." Dr. Hayes made his way up the winding road to Blackwood Manor, medical bag in hand. The messenger had arrived at dawn. The housekeeper had taken ill, and his services were required. Hayes suspected it was merely an excuse. In the 5 years he had lived in Blackridge, he had never once been summoned to treat a servant at the mansion. More likely, Blackwood wanted a discreet assessment of his bride-to-be's health before finalizing their arrangement. The thought sickened Hayes, but it also presented an opportunity he couldn't ignore. The mansion's iron gates swung open at his approach, and a stable hand appeared to take the reins of his horse. The massive front door opened before he could knock, revealing the butler's impassive face. "Dr. Hayes, Mr. Blackwood is expecting you in his study. Please follow me." Hayes nodded, clutching his medical bag a little tighter, feeling the weight of the folded paper hidden in its false bottom. The message Sheriff Keller had entrusted to him late last night. Sarah sat rigidly as the seamstress took her measurements, the woman's hands efficient and impersonal as they stretched the tape across her shoulders, waist, and hips. The middle-aged woman, Mrs. Chen, worked in silence, occasionally making notes in a small book. Her expression revealed nothing, but her gentle touch held a hint of compassion that brought unexpected tears to Sarah's eyes. When the seamstress knelt to measure the length of her skirt, their eyes met briefly, and Mrs. Chen gave an almost imperceptible nod of understanding. "The dress will be white silk with seed pearls," she said, her accented voice low enough that the hovering maid couldn't hear. "Very beautiful. Take 2 weeks to make properly." Sarah frowned at this information. Blackwood had specified the wedding would take place in 1 week. Before she could question this discrepancy, the door opened, and Dr. Hayes entered, followed by the butler. "Mr. Blackwood requests that you undergo a brief examination, miss," the butler announced. Standard procedure for all new members of the household. Sheriff Keller sat at his desk, reviewing the documents spread before him, land deeds, bank transfers, and legal complaints that painted a damning picture of Edmund Blackwood's rise to power. The information had come at great cost, gathered piece by piece over months of discreet investigation. Together, they revealed a pattern of fraud, intimidation, and occasionally violence that had allowed Blackwood to amass his fortune at the expense of countless others. The most damning evidence concerned the original Blackridge silver strike. The claim that it started it all had been stolen through forged documents and perjured testimony. If proven, it would invalidate nearly every subsequent acquisition, bringing Blackwood's empire crashing down. Keller gathered the papers carefully, tucking them into an oilskin pouch. His plan was risky. Success depended on perfect timing and allies he wasn't entirely sure he could trust. But the arrival of Sarah Thornton at Blackwood Manor had forced his hand. Some injustices were too great to ignore, even for a man who had spent years looking the other way. "I won't require a chaperone for this examination, Doctor," Hayes said firmly when the maid made no move to leave the room. His tone allowed no argument, and after a moment's hesitation, both she and the seamstress withdrew, leaving him alone with Sarah. As soon as the door closed, Hayes's professional demeanor softened. "Miss Thornton, I haven't much time. Are you being held here against your will?" The directness of his question startled Sarah. "Yes," she admitted, relief flooding through her at finally being able to speak the truth. "My father traded me to Blackwood for a mining claim and money. I'm to marry him within the week." Hayes nodded grimly. "I feared as much. Sheriff Keller sent me with a message." He glanced at the door, then extracted a folded paper from a hidden compartment in his medical bag. "Read it quickly, then burn it. Help is coming, but you must play along for now." Edmund Blackwood surveyed the construction site of his new processing mill, satisfaction evident in his normally impassive face. The massive structure was taking shape rapidly, the foundation already set and the framework rising against the Dakota sky. Soon, ore from his mines would be processed here instead of being shipped east, saving considerable expense and increasing his already substantial profits. His foreman approached, removing his hat respectfully. "Railroad surveyors finished marking the route this morning, Mr. Blackwood. Everything's on schedule, except—" He hesitated, clearly reluctant to deliver bad news. Blackwood's expression hardened. "Except?" The foreman swallowed nervously. "The Ferguson property, sir. Without it, the rail line will need to make a significant detour, adding miles and considerable expense." Blackwood's jaw tightened. "Ferguson will sell. One way or another, he'll sell." He turned to his waiting carriage, thoughts shifting to his other acquisition. The Thornton girl continued to display a stubborn streak, but he was confident that time and the realities of her situation would bend her to his will. By this time next week, she would be Mrs. Edmund Blackwood, and the last obstacle to his railroad would be removed. Thomas Thornton stumbled from the assay office, clutching a paper that confirmed his worst fears. The claim Blackwood had given him, supposedly rich in silver, had been salted. A common mining fraud, with traces of ore sprinkled into worthless rock to deceive the unwary. He had been duped again by the man who had taken everything from him years ago. Fury and shame warred within him as he made his way to Holcomb's saloon, his newfound friends already abandoning him as word of his worthless claim spread through town. The whiskey still flowed, but now on credit that Holcomb extended with barely concealed contempt. Thomas drank steadily, the alcohol fueling a rage that had been smoldering for years. Blackwood had taken his original claim, his reputation, his future, and now his daughter, all while making him appear the fool. Through the haze of drink, a plan began to form. Reckless, likely suicidal, but the only path his pride would allow. If he could not reclaim what Blackwood had stolen, he could at least ensure the man paid a price for his latest treachery. Sarah moved through the enormous mansion, memorizing its layout while appearing to admire its luxuries. Dr. Hayes's message had been brief but clear. Sheriff Keller was gathering evidence against Blackwood, evidence that could free her from this forced marriage and possibly restore some of what her father had lost years ago. But the sheriff needed time, and Sarah's role was to play the gradually acquiescing bride-to-be, giving no indication that resistance still burned within her. It was a difficult performance for someone unaccustomed to deception, but the alternative, becoming Blackwood's true wife, strengthened her resolve. She paused before a large portrait in the main hall, a stern-faced woman in outdated finery whom she assumed was Blackwood's mother. "Mrs. Blackwood the Elder," confirmed a voice behind her. Sarah turned to find Blackwood watching her, his expression unreadable. "A formidable woman. You remind me of her somewhat, that same stubborn set to the jaw." The comparison was clearly intended as a compliment, but Sarah felt only revulsion at being likened to the woman who had raised such a son. Still, she forced a small smile, remembering her role. "I hope I can live up to her example." Blackwood seemed pleased with this response, moving closer until he stood beside her, studying the portrait. "She built this house, you know. My father struck the first silver. But it was my mother who transformed our wealth into respectability. The frontier needed her kind, women of steel who could civilize the wilderness while the men conquered it." His hand came to rest possessively on the small of Sarah's back. "Our children will inherit an empire, not build one. They'll need a mother who understands the weight of such a legacy." Sarah suppressed a shudder at his touch, at the casual way he spoke of children they would never have, if she had any say in the matter. "I've always believed in the importance of family," she said carefully, the words ashen in her mouth. Night had fallen by the time Sheriff Keller made his way to the Ferguson Ranch for the second time that week. The old rancher was waiting for him, along with two unexpected guests, Dr. Hayes and Mrs. Chen, the seamstress. "Your message said urgent," Ferguson growled, ushering everyone inside and bolting the door. "This about Blackwood?" Keller nodded, placing his oilskin packet on the table. "Got enough evidence to bring him down, but I need to move carefully. He's got too many friends in high places." He turned to Mrs. Chen, whose typically reserved expression had given way to grim determination. "You're sure about helping us? Blackwood could make things very difficult for you and your husband." The seamstress's chin lifted. These prove that Blackwood's original claim, the one that started his fortune, was obtained through fraud. He forged documents and bribed officials to steal it from its rightful owner." Hayes leaned forward, examining the yellowed papers. "And who was the rightful owner?" Keller's expression was grim as he slid a faded deed across the table. "Thomas Thornton, Sarah's father." The revelation landed like a thunderclap in the small cabin. "You're saying?" Ferguson began. Keller nodded. "Everything Blackwood owns was built on what he stole from Thornton, including the claim he just traded back to him for his daughter." Sarah watched from her bedroom window as Blackwood's carriage departed for town, a small sense of relief washing over her at his absence. The past 2 days had been an exercise in constant vigilance, forcing herself to play the role of the gradually yielding captive while giving nothing of true value away. Blackwood was no fool. His sharp eyes missed little, and several times she had caught him studying her when he thought her attention elsewhere, as if trying to decipher her thoughts. The sound of a soft knock drew her attention from the window. Mrs. Chen stood in the doorway, a basket of fabric samples in her arms. "For wedding dress," she explained loudly for the benefit of the maid dusting in the hallway. Once inside with the door closed, however, her demeanor changed. "Message from Sheriff," she whispered, slipping a small folded paper from beneath the fabric. "Say read quick and burn." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the note. The words were few, but electrifying. "Evidence found. Move against B. Saturday morning. Be ready to leave quickly. Tell no one." Thomas Thornton lay on his thin mattress in the cabin he had once shared with his daughter, staring at the ceiling with unaccustomed clarity. 2 days of sobriety had been hell, but necessary for what he planned. The loaded revolver beside him gleamed dully in the lamplight. An old Colt he had carried since his prospecting days. One bullet for Blackwood, and perhaps one for himself afterward. It hardly mattered. His life had effectively ended years ago when he lost his claim and his self-respect. Only now, with the realization of what he had done to Sarah, had the full weight of his disgrace become unbearable. The sound of approaching horses snapped him from his dark contemplation. Visitors at this hour could only mean trouble. Thomas grabbed the revolver and moved to the window, peering cautiously through a gap in the ragged curtains. Sheriff Keller dismounted in the yard, followed by Dr. Hayes. Not the law coming for him then, at least not yet. Thomas tucked the revolver into his waistband and opened the door. "Thornton?" Keller nodded curtly, his distaste for the man evident despite his professional demeanor. "We need to talk." Thomas stepped aside, allowing the men to enter the sparse cabin. If Thomas flushed, his hand moving unconsciously toward the hidden revolver. "What business is it of yours?" Keller's patience, never abundant, visibly thinned. "It's my business when a man plans murder in my jurisdiction. Sit down, Thornton, before you do something even more foolish than selling your daughter for whiskey money." The harsh words struck home, and Thomas sank onto a chair, shame momentarily overwhelming his anger. Keller placed a familiar-looking document on the table, the original deed to Thomas's claim, the one he had lost to Blackwood years ago. "You recognize this? Where did you get that?" Thomas's voice was barely a whisper, his eyes fixed on the yellowed paper that represented all he had lost. "Been doing some digging," Keller replied. "This deed was never legally transferred to Blackwood. The documents he used to claim your property were forgeries." Thomas's head snapped up, disbelief warring with a desperate hope in his bloodshot eyes. "What are you saying?" Hayes leaned forward. "He's saying Blackwood stole your claim, Thornton. Everything he's built since, the mines, the ranches, that mansion on the hill, it's all built on what rightfully belongs to you." The implications landed like physical blows as Thomas struggled to comprehend what he was hearing. "Then, Sarah," Keller's expression hardened, "is being held by a thief and a fraud. We're going to get her out and bring Blackwood down, but we need your help, and it doesn't involve that revolver in your waistband." Up at Blackwood Manor, dinner had become an increasingly tense affair as the wedding day approached. Sarah sat across from her captor at the massive mahogany table, picking at food that, despite its quality, tasted like ash in her mouth. Blackwood watched her with calculated intensity, a predator assessing its prey. "You're quiet tonight," he observed, swirling wine in a crystal glass. "Having second thoughts about our arrangement?" Sarah looked up, carefully schooling her features into what she hoped was an expression of nervous anticipation rather than the dread she actually felt. "Just wedding nerves, I suppose. Everything is happening so quickly." Blackwood seemed to accept this explanation, his posture relaxing slightly. "Understandable, but unnecessary. As I've said, your life here will be comfortable, enviable even. Many women would consider themselves fortunate." Sarah forced a small smile. "And do you consider yourself fortunate, Mr. Blackwood? Or is this marriage merely another business transaction?" The question appeared to catch him off guard, a rare occurrence that gave Sarah a moment's satisfaction. Blackwood set down his wineglass, studying her with renewed interest. An unexpected question from an unexpected bride. Very well. He leaned forward slightly. "I consider myself a practical man, Miss Thornton. My first marriage was a business arrangement that served its purpose until my wife's untimely death. This second union is similarly practical. I require an heir and a hostess for this house, but I find myself intrigued by your spirit. It suggests our arrangement may provide satisfactions beyond the merely practical." The implication sent a chill down Sarah's spine, but she maintained her facade. "I see. And what becomes of my father after our marriage?" Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. He received his payment. "What he does with it is no longer my concern, or yours. You would be wise to forget Thomas Thornton. Your future lies here, with me." Sheriff Keller stood before the territorial judge, a grim-faced man whose weathered features revealed little as he reviewed the documents spread across his desk. Judge Harlan Monroe had ridden into Blackridge the previous evening, responding to Keller's urgent telegram with unexpected speed. The judge's reputation for incorruptibility had made him Keller's only choice for presenting the evidence against Blackwood. "These are serious allegations, Sheriff," Monroe said finally, looking up from the papers. "Fraud, bribery, theft of property. If proven, they would nullify virtually every business transaction Blackwood has conducted over the past decade." Keller nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. And there's the matter of coercion in the case of Sarah Thornton." Monroe's frown deepened. The forced marriage. Yes, particularly troubling. He gathered the documents carefully, securing them in his leather portfolio. "I'll issue the necessary warrants immediately. How do you wish to proceed with the arrest?" "Carefully," Keller replied. "Blackwood has men throughout the town, including 2 on my own staff that I don't fully trust. If he gets wind of this before we can move, Miss Thornton could be in danger and evidence might disappear." The judge nodded, understanding the delicacy of the situation. "We'll need the territorial marshals. I can have 3 men here by tomorrow evening." He fixed Keller with a stern gaze. "Until then, maintain absolute secrecy. No moves against Blackwood until we're fully prepared." Keller agreed, though inwardly he worried about Sarah, alone in that mansion for another full day. The judge seemed to read his thoughts. "The girl has survived this long, Sheriff. One more day won't break her. Better to move with certainty than rush and fail." The lawman nodded reluctantly. One more day. Sarah would have to maintain her performance for just one more day. Saturday dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect autumn day that seemed designed for a wedding. At Blackwood Manor, the household was in carefully orchestrated chaos as servants prepared for the small but elegant ceremony scheduled for noon. In her room, Sarah stood still as Mrs. Chen made final adjustments to her wedding dress, a creation of white silk and seed pearls that would have been the envy of any Eastern socialite. The seamstress worked silently, her clever fingers securing a loose pearl, while her eyes conveyed a clear message: be ready. Sarah's stomach churned with nervous anticipation. According to the sheriff's latest message, Judge Monroe and the marshals had arrived during the night. They would come for Blackwood before the ceremony, ending this nightmare before it could be completed. But as the morning wore on, with no sign of rescue, doubt began to creep into her mind. Had something gone wrong? Edmund Blackwood adjusted his cravat before the mirror, satisfaction evident in his expression. Today marked the culmination of careful planning, the acquisition of a suitable wife who would enhance his social standing and eventually provide the heir his empire required. The Thornton girl had proven more interesting than expected, her spirit providing a welcome challenge after years of being surrounded by sycophants and servants who jumped at his every command. Breaking that spirit would be an entertaining diversion during the coming winter months. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he called, expecting his valet with the specially ordered boutonniere. Instead, Maxwell Holcomb stood in the doorway, his normally florid face pale with urgency. "Forgive the intrusion on your wedding day, sir," the saloon-keeper said, his voice low, despite the closed door. "But I've just learned something you need to hear immediately." Sheriff Keller led the small procession up the winding road to Blackwood Manor, Judge Monroe riding beside him, 3 U.S. Marshals following close behind, and Thomas Thornton bringing up the rear. Thomas looked like a different man after 3 days of enforced sobriety, his eyes clear for the first time in years, his bearing straight, despite the shame that still hung heavy on his shoulders. The territorial marshals were hard-faced men who had seen every variety of frontier justice and injustice, their expressions revealing nothing as they approached the mansion that represented one of the territory's greatest fortunes. Judge Monroe carried his leather portfolio containing the warrants and evidence, his judicial authority adding legitimacy to what might otherwise be seen as a local vendetta against a powerful man. As they approached the ornate iron gates, Keller was surprised to find them standing open, unguarded. A sense of foreboding settled over him. "Something's wrong," he muttered, spurring his horse into a trot up the final stretch of road. Sarah felt her heart sink as Blackwood himself appeared in her doorway, dismissing Mrs. Chen with a curt gesture. The seamstress hesitated, her eyes meeting Sarah's briefly before she gathered her things and slipped out, leaving bride and groom alone. A serious breach of propriety that boded ill. Blackwood closed the door behind him, leaning against it as he surveyed Sarah in her wedding finery, his expression unreadable. "Beautiful," he said after a long moment. "A shame it's all been for nothing." Sarah's mouth went dry. "I don't understand." Blackwood moved further into the room, his calm demeanor more frightening than any display of anger would have been. "An interesting conspiracy has been unfolding around me, it seems. The sheriff, the doctor, a Chinese seamstress, and now I learn that Judge Monroe himself has ridden into town." His smile was cold. "Did you really think I wouldn't have eyes and ears everywhere in my own town, Sarah?" The use of her given name, the first time he had addressed her so intimately, sent a chill through her. "What happens now?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady, despite the fear coursing through her. Blackwood moved to the window, looking down at the approach to his home. "Now we adapt. The carriage is waiting at the rear entrance. We'll be crossing into Wyoming territory before the good sheriff reaches the front door. He turned back to her, and now there was a dangerous edge to his voice. "I've spent 15 years building this empire. I won't lose it to a washed-up prospector and a small-town lawman with delusions of justice." He crossed the room in 2 quick strides, gripping her arm with painful intensity. "You're still mine, purchased and paid for. The wedding can wait until we're safely established elsewhere." The scene that greeted Keller and his party as they reached Blackwood Manor confirmed his worst fears. The massive front doors stood open, servants scurrying about in confusion, while a thin plume of smoke rose from what appeared to be the study. "Spread out," he ordered the marshals. "Check every room. Judge, stay here with Thornton." Keller drew his revolver and entered the mansion, moving quickly through the opulent rooms until he reached the source of the smoke, Blackwood's study, where a fire burned in the grate, consuming what looked like financial ledgers and documents. "Damn it," he muttered, using a poker to drag half-burned papers from the flames. Too late to save most of them, but perhaps enough remained to piece together Blackwood's crimes. A marshal appeared in the doorway. "No sign of Blackwood or the girl, Sheriff, but there's a stable boy who says they left by carriage about 20 minutes ago, heading west." Sarah stumbled as Blackwood dragged her down the servant's staircase, her elaborate wedding dress hampering her movements. "You're hurting me," she protested, trying to pull away from his bruising grip. Blackwood didn't slow or loosen his hold. "Consider it the first of many lessons in obedience," he growled. "I've been too lenient with you." They emerged into the kitchen, now empty of servants, and continued through to a back door that opened onto a small courtyard where a closed carriage waited. 2 powerful horses harnessed and ready. The driver, one of Blackwood's most trusted men, sat impassively on the box, giving no indication that forcing an unwilling bride into a getaway carriage was anything out of the ordinary. Blackwood shoved Sarah toward the conveyance, his expression darkening as she resisted. "Get in, or I'll have Jenkins tie you like a calf for branding." Sarah looked desperately around the courtyard, seeking any means of escape or delay. Help was so close, if she could just stall for a few more minutes. "Sarah!" The voice that called her name was one she hadn't heard without a drunken slur in years. Thomas Thornton stood at the corner of the mansion, his face transformed by sobriety and purpose. Beside him, Judge Monroe and one of the marshals advanced cautiously, weapons drawn. Blackwood's reaction was instantaneous. He pulled Sarah against him, a small derringer appearing in his hand, pressed against her ribs. "Stay back," he warned, his voice ice-cold, "or the bride doesn't make it to the altar." Thomas took a step forward despite the threat, his hands empty and raised. "Let her go, Blackwood. It's me you want to deal with." Blackwood's laugh was bitter. "Deal with you? I've been dealing with you for 15 years, Thornton, taking what should have been mine from the beginning." The admission hung in the air, damning in its clarity. Judge Monroe stepped forward. "Edmund Blackwood, I have warrants for your arrest on charges of fraud, theft of property, and coercion. Release Miss Thornton and surrender yourself." "I think not, Your Honor," Blackwood replied, backing toward the waiting carriage, dragging Sarah with him. "Wyoming is lovely this time of year, and their territorial officials are far more accommodating than yourself." He had nearly reached the carriage when a shot rang out. Blackwood jerked, his grip on Sarah loosening as blood bloomed on his shoulder. Sarah tore herself from his grasp, stumbling toward her father as Blackwood fell against the carriage wheel, the derringer dropping from his suddenly nerveless fingers. Sheriff Keller stepped from the shadows of the stable, his revolver still trained on the wounded man. "It's over, Blackwood," he said quietly. "Has been for a while." The marshals moved in quickly, securing the mining magnate despite his pained protests. Sarah fell into her father's arms, tears of relief streaming down her face. The beautiful wedding dress now torn and stained, a fitting end to a union that had been rotten from inception. Epilogue: Black Ridge, Dakota Territory. 6 months later. The town no longer bore Blackwood's name. After his conviction and sentencing to 15 years in territorial prison, the residents had voted to rename it Silver Creek after the small waterway that ran alongside the main street. The Thornton Mining Company offices occupied what had once been Blackwood Manor, the massive house now serving as headquarters for the operation that Thomas Thornton had established with his restored property and wealth. Sarah sat at the large desk in what had been Blackwood's study, reviewing production figures from the past quarter. At 23, she had discovered an unexpected talent for business, becoming the administrative force behind her father's reclaimed empire. Thomas had changed as well, maintaining his sobriety and working alongside the miners. His practical experience proving invaluable as they expanded operations along the new railroad spur that now connected Silver Creek to markets in the east. Sheriff Keller entered without knocking, a habit that reflected their comfortable friendship. "Production reports look good," Sarah observed, setting aside the papers. Keller nodded, settling into a chair across from her. Since bringing down Blackwood, the lawman had become something of an unofficial advisor to the Thorntons, his understanding of territorial law and business proving invaluable during the complex process of reclaiming what had been stolen. "Ferguson signed the final agreement this morning," he informed her. "The railroad will cross his northwest corner, and he's got free shipping for his cattle for the next decade." Sarah smiled with genuine pleasure. "Excellent. That completes the main line." She rose, moving to the large windows that overlooked the town, so different from the view Blackwood had surveyed with such cold calculation. "Sometimes I can hardly believe how much has changed," she mused. 6 months ago, I was to be traded for a bottle of whiskey and a worthless claim." Keller's expression softened as he joined her at the window. "And now, you're the most eligible young lady in the territory. Half the men in town would offer far more than whiskey for your hand." Sarah laughed, the sound free and genuine in a way it never could have been within these same walls under their previous owner. "And receive the same answer Blackwood did, though more politely delivered." Her expression grew more serious. "I've had enough of being traded or purchased. When I marry, it will be on my terms, to a man who sees me as a partner, not property." Keller smiled. "A wise decision, and one you can afford to make now." They stood in companionable silence, watching the activity in the town below. Miners changing shifts, shopkeepers serving customers, children playing in the spring sunshine. Silver Creek was thriving under its new management, the wealth of the mines now flowing more equitably through the community instead of being hoarded by one man. Thomas Thornton entered, his once stooped shoulders now straight, his face weathered but clear-eyed and purposeful. "Rails are laid all the way to Ferguson's north boundary," he announced with satisfaction. "First regular shipments can start next week." He joined his daughter and the sheriff at the window, his expression reflecting wonder at the transformation of their lives. "Never thought I'd stand in this room as anything but a supplicant," he admitted quietly, "let alone as its owner." Sarah squeezed his hand, understanding all that remained unspoken between them, the guilt he still carried for how close he had come to sacrificing her, the gratitude for her forgiveness, the shared determination to build something worthwhile from the ruins of Blackwood's empire. "We should celebrate," she suggested. "Perhaps dinner at the new hotel?" Thomas nodded. "I'll invite Hayes and Mrs. Chen as well. Wouldn't be standing here without them." As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across what had once been Blackwood's domain, Sarah reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here. Traded for a bottle of whiskey, she had nearly become the bride of the territory's ruthless millionaire. Instead, she had found something far more valuable. Not just wealth or position, but purpose and self-determination. The mansion on the hill no longer represented oppression and greed, but second chances and justice restored. And if the ghost of Edmund Blackwood still haunted its corridors, plotting and scheming behind bars in the territorial prison, his influence diminished with each passing day as Silver Creek forged a new identity from the ashes of his fallen empire. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.